So the next culture we're going to be looking at is Greece. And looking at Greek culture is fairly important for discussing Western civilization because a lot of the values that are founded here end up translating into the values you might think of as being formative of how you live your life today. You have the map here, of course, and you may notice that these are going to be people who are going to be traders, right? They're located on the sea, and so they're going to be trading with many different people. We start to see a lot of globalism kind of emerging at this point because of their location. Now, I wanted to speak to two major concepts that we do think are very important for Greek culture, but again, also you may notice in your cultural life today. You see them listed here, of course, humanism and democracy. The first one, humanism, it is what it sounds like. It's the idea of the human being central, the human being first. You might also use the term individualism, the individual, right? So, why is this important for us? Well, we live in a very humanistic culture as Americans, right? I'm speaking from an American perspective, obviously, where we believe that the I, the individual, can contribute, can do something. The Greeks believed this also, which is why I have the Parthenon up for you, because it is a great example of two men, Myktinos and Kallikrates, who were architects who basically designed this amazing structure. Think back to the Egyptians and think of, the idea of a named architect was very common. I'd argue no. We talked about the step pyramid, but that's pretty much it. So this idea of having a, named person acknowledged as far as for their contributions, it's something that doesn't really come about until the Greek time period. I'd argue that Egyptian culture, for instance, if you think about it, is really governed by the idea of the gods, the pharaoh. It didn't matter what the little people wanted or thought or did, which leads us to democracy. Those cultures, again, like Egyptian culture, the pharaoh decided everything. The Greek culture is the first one where we see a plethora of voices, a multitude of voices being able to say, these are the things that we believe, these are our values. So this is a new sort of idea of how to govern. Now, be clear that their idea of democracy is not like ours. It was basically, titled men who had money, who had land, right, who were going to be the ones who made the decision. So it's not like democracy as you may think of it here in America. We also have to think about the fact that Greeks organized themselves around the idea of a city-state, or what we call a polis. And, a lot of times people say, oh, the Greeks. And, you really can't say that because each Greek city-state was so unique and individual. I always use Athens because the Athenians were the artistic people, right? They were the ones who made pottery, who wrote poetry. Now you go to a city-state like Sparta, they were going to be known for their warfare, right? Their tactics in war. Two very different attitudes, right, of two different, very different city-states. And so, you have to think of the Greeks as being this conglomeration, right, of city-states with all kinds of different values kind of happening. So for us, Athens makes sense. And again, if you look down here in the agora, or agora as we call it, you might go down here to like the painted stoa and think about the fact that this is where they would have shown the paintings. This is how much they loved art, right? You also can come up here and look at the Acropolis. Polis, right, city. Acro, high. This was the high city of Athens. It's where the religious, worship would happen. Now, if someone says to you, hey, I went on vacation and I went to the Acropolis, you're going to think of this Acropolis. But for someone like me, who's an art historian, I would say, well, which Acropolis? Because each city-state had an Acropolis. It's just that we think of the famous Athenian Acropolis as being the Acropolis, but it's just a term. Each city had a place where they worshiped their gods. Here, of course, they worshiped Athena. Makes sense, right? And to speak to the gods, I wanted to mention that the impact of humanism here, I think, is very important. These are still polytheists, right? These are people who still worship multiple gods. But what we'd argue is the gods act more human than gods we might encounter in Egypt, let's say. To me, like Ra is a very, distant god. He's the sun god. He influences the pharaoh, but I don't think the everyday people are like, oh, me and Ra have a relationship, or I really relate to Ra. He's a god. You were intimidated by him. That's about it. He was in charge. Now, if you look at these gods, they have funny human stories attached to them. Zeus, king of the gods, he liked to get around. His wife, Hera, goddess of marriage, you should laugh a little bit, right? The pottery that you're seeing here is Zeus transforming himself into a white bull. What a trickster, right? To seduce Europa. These are the kind of tricks he'd play. Now, I don't know about you, but there's something a little soap opera-y, or human and funny about this king of the gods, right, who has a human weakness of loving beauty and loving sex, right? Being married to this, goddess of marriage, so it's kind of funny. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, messing around with Ares, the god of war. Cupid, of course, is their son. But Aphrodite, if you know your mythology, was married to Hephaestus. So again, messing around, right? Athena, right? I bring her up because, of course, we'll talk about the Parthenon and such. And then, of course, Dionysus, right? The god, I always say, of wine and partying. That's a pretty human thing, too, I think. So again, we'll think about the gods and their impact on the artistic pieces that we look at.